Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Sunday Show. I'm Martin Geisler. After that staggering spectacle in Washington, has the world just become a more dangerous place? And what on earth happens next? I'll be exploring all of that and more with the First Minister, John Swinney, who will join me live from Butte House. Also this morning, do our climate ambitions and the planet face another existential threat as energy companies ditch the green agenda? Nigel Topping from the Climate Change Committee will be here. He says there is still money to be made from cutting carbon. But with BP predicting huge demand for oil and gas well beyond 2050, what now for the so-called just transition? I'll put that question to the Green leader, Patrick Harvvey. After that, it is over to Andrew Black on the radio and on BBC Sounds. Hi, Andrew.
Hi there, Martin. I'm going to be speaking to the head of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee as NATO puts pressure on President Zelensky to repair relations with Donald Trump. Musicians have used last night's Brit Awards to criticise bad treatment by big record labels. We'll ask if the industry is really listening. We're going to be looking ahead to the Oscars, and we'll have our regular review of the Sunday newspapers as well.
All right, Andrew, thanks very much indeed for that. More from Andrew on the radio at 10:30. Let's get on with the show. Yeah, it's a pretty stark series of questions we're posing this morning, but that is the way the world looks this weekend, I'm afraid. You'll have your own thoughts, I'm sure, on all of this. Do feel free to share them with us if you feel like it. The hashtag on social media, as ever, BBC Sunday Show. Well, no matter your politics, I'm sure you'll agree Friday's scenes at the Oval Office were utterly extraordinary. Momentous in the truest sense of the word. It was Otto von Bismarck who said, "Man can't control the currents of events, just float with them and steer." But how on earth do you even stay afloat, let alone steer, when those currents turn into the raging torrent we're watching just now? European leaders are meeting in London this morning, and of course, President Trump has been invited to the UK for a state visit too, with speculation that a trip to Scotland would be high on the itinerary. Well, let's go live to Butte House and speak to the First Minister, John Swinney. Good morning, First Minister.
Good morning, Martin.
Well, look, in a pretty bleak weekend, I'm pleased to say you injected a little ray of sunshine yesterday with the announcement that you've become a granddad. Congratulations first from all of us. But a new life into a pretty uncertain world. How are you feeling about what you're watching at the moment?
I'm obviously overjoyed at the birth of my first grandson, Rua, and I'm so delighted about that news, and I'm deeply appreciative to many, many people across the country for their good wishes to my family. But I'm deeply troubled about the situation that we face at this particular moment, because the storm clouds are gathering ferociously above us, and we need to realise the significance of the moment that we face and the necessity for us to secure a lasting peace that involves the security and the protection of Ukraine. And that's the issue that is absolutely central to all of my thinking at this particular moment, that we need to secure the future peace and the independence and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, because that is the pathway to stability and peace in Europe.
Even if that means fighting for longer in a war that seems unwinnable at the moment?
What we've got to recognise is the nature of the threat that is posed by Russia. And Russia embarked on an illegal invasion of Ukraine. It has the potential, well, it's doing it just now, it's causing enormous instability across the international community. And as a consequence of all of that, we need to be aware of the need to see out the course on Ukraine and to make sure that Ukraine has got a secure future. And that must be the central consideration. And of course, as we look at events over the last couple of weeks, and they in a sense reached their climax on Friday evening in the Oval Office, we can see just the uncertainty that has unfolded over that path to peace and security in Ukraine, which all of us thought the international community was committed to delivering.
Yeah.
And that's the essential question that we have to wrestle with at this moment.
Well, what happened at the Oval Office shocked a great many people. Sir Keir Starmer seems to be playing a fairly significant role in all of this. He's been on the phone to both President Trump and he has spoken clearly at Downing Street to President Zelensky. How do you feel he has been doing so far, Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I welcome the role that the Prime Minister is taking, and I support him in his endeavours to try to find a way through what is a very, very difficult situation. And I want to make sure that we work very closely with our European partners, because it's European security that is under threat, and the gathering that the Prime Minister is convening today is welcome in London of a variety of European leaders. I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to try to find a way forward with the United States, because the position that unfolded on Friday evening was not only deeply troubling to watch and to see a courageous leader of a courageous country being berated in the fashion that President Zelensky was, is completely unacceptable, but I very much welcome what the Prime Minister is trying to do to try to make progress through a difficult situation. But fundamentally, that must be about securing the peace in Ukraine and securing the independence and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Because if we don't do that, then Russia will see that as a green light to do other things on the international stage, which will be deeply damaging to all of us and to our way of life.
Well, if you welcome what the Prime Minister is doing just now, you have a problem with your leader in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, do you not? He has called the Prime Minister weak, and he said in a post on Twitter, quote, "Starmer had better get back up off his knees and revoke that offer of a state visit." That has rattled Sir Keir Starmer, I think. He said to Laura Kuenssberg this morning, "I'm serious, I want a lasting peace, I won't be diverted by the SNP or others ramping up the rhetoric on Twitter." What do you think of what Stephen Flynn said?
Well, there's lots of people expressing concern about the situation we find ourselves in as a consequence of the experience in the Oval Office on Friday night. And what I've made clear is that we must have a cool and rational way through all of the challenges that we face. I welcome what the Prime Minister is doing to try to achieve that, but fundamentally we have to take some tough and hard decisions. I've said that I cannot see how a state visit can go ahead for President Trump to the United Kingdom if President Trump is not a steadfast ally of ours in protecting the future of Ukraine. And that seems to me an absolutely fundamental requirement of any offer of a state visit to the President of the United States, is that he is absolutely full square with us in protecting Ukraine and ensuring its independence. Because if we don't do that, then I think we are undermining the future of Western democracy, the future of liberal democracy, and we cannot afford to do that.
So as things stand, unless he changes his tune, you think that state visit should be, the offer of that state visit should be revoked, is that right?
I watched the Prime Minister on television this morning, and the Prime Minister is talking about the work he's undertaking to try to improve the situation with President Trump as a consequence of the Oval Office meeting on Friday. And I wish the Prime Minister well in that endeavour, because it would be better for us all if the United States and Europe were speaking as one in steadfast support of Ukraine. That's where I want us to be, because I think that's the way to protect the democracy and to protect the freedoms that we have all enjoyed for all of my life. But I think those opportunities, those freedoms, are under threat if we don't stop Russia at this particular moment. And a note of significant uncertainty was injected into this on Friday night. The spokesperson for the President of the United States said they were going to end all support for Ukraine. If that's the case, then I cannot see in all conscience how we can take forward a second state visit for the President of the United States to the United Kingdom, because he's not a steadfast ally of ours in our battle for freedom, and he must be.
If they don't revoke that support, if things go on as they are at the moment, and should that state visit go ahead, and if it did, would you meet President Trump if he came to Scotland?
I've always said that I think it's important that we have dialogue with President Trump so that we can protect and promote the interests of our country. And I would take that forward. I've made it clear I would do that. It's been, I've had faced some criticism for the fact that I've said that, but I do think as First Minister, people would expect me to engage with the President of the United States. But that doesn't mean that I've got to agree with everything that the President of the United States says or does. And on this occasion, I think the events in the Oval Office on Friday night were enormously damaging to the protection of the liberal values and the democratic systems that we all cherish in Western Europe. And I want to make sure that we work with the United States to secure that peace. But the United States must be a willing partner in so doing, and it didn't look like it on Friday night.
Is there an argument that you know, President Macron, Sir Keir Starmer, both went to the White House last week and might not have enjoyed what they had to go through, but did the diplomatic thing, sucked it up, shook the hands, touched the knees, did all that, and President Zelensky just had to do that, just grin and bear it and take it and leave, and he just failed in his diplomatic duty almost in that, and that has been as damaging as anything. You know what you're dealing with in Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. It's unpleasant, but it just has to be survived for the greater good.
I think President Zelensky has demonstrated the most remarkable human courage, along with his people, over the course of the last 3 years. And Ukraine was expected to crumble. And President Zelensky has led with incredible dignity and courage and steadfastness in protecting the interests of his country in the face of the most barbaric invasion by Russia. And I certainly don't think he should have experienced what he experienced on Friday night in the Oval Office. I think that was a really damaging moment for the international community, for international solidarity. And the sooner there can be a repair to the damage that was done and a focus on securing the independence of Ukraine and the peace in Western Europe, the better from my point of view, because that will be central to all of our futures in Western Europe.
The Prime Minister announced last week defence spending would go up, not by much, by 0.2% to 2.5% of GDP. There's a suggestion now it's almost certainly going to have to go up by more, maybe 3%, maybe more than that. That would almost inevitably mean taxing, borrowing, cutting. Would you back that? Would you back more taxes in the interests of increased defence?
I think we've got to have an honest discussion about the need about the priorities in our defence expenditure. It's a long-held view of mine and my party that we should not be spending on nuclear weapons. We should be spending instead on conventional weaponry, which frankly would be a great deal more use in the current context than having an arsenal of nuclear weapons. But there also has to be an honest discussion and debate about defence expenditure and taxation and the whole range of public commitments that the government makes. And my government has been prepared to take the hard decisions on tax, to increase tax on those on higher earnings so that we can fund the public services that we successfully delivered the budget for in the budget debate on Tuesday in the Scottish Parliament. And I think that debate has got to take its course across the whole of the United Kingdom so that we can fund the priorities to create a civilised society here in our own country where we invest in our public services, but where we can also guarantee our security as a country with effective defence expenditure. And that's a debate that's got to be had, and we must have that as a country to make sure we take the right decisions to protect our society, but also to invest in our society and to create the best future for our people.
You confirmed last week that you maintain your stance on Trident, that Trident shouldn't be here in Scotland, but that was before what happened on Friday night. Do you absolutely stand by that now? Can you still have an anti-Trident stance as a party, as a government, when in a world in which weakening yourself is not a good look at the moment?
I don't view nuclear weapons as a badge of strength or a badge of security. I would much rather have the conventional weaponry that can actually protect our country. We've got an enormous coastline around our country. We've got huge air and sea space around our country that must be protected, and I want us to be able to do that. And I think the United Kingdom does not have the right priorities in defence with the significant investment that's required in nuclear weapons. I think what we've got to do is to make sure we've got effective conventional forces and that we can support our allies when they are facing difficulties and challenge as Ukraine faces at this very moment.
Okay.
So these are the priorities that I believe are important in securing the future of our country and its defence. On
doing that, First Minister, lastly and briefly if you could, can you see a scenario in which Scottish boots could be on Ukrainian soil, Scottish military boots could be on Ukrainian soil, well, by the end of this year, say?
I think there is the possibility as some form of peacekeeping role that might be the case. I've said that the Prime Minister should bring such proposals to the House of Commons. and the House of Commons should consider those proposals, and we should do it openly and democratically. But I think that securing the future of Ukraine is vital to securing the peace for Western Europe that we've cherished all of my life, and I want to see that maintained in the future.
All right, well, that is clear. First Minister John Swinney, thank you very much indeed for being with us this Sunday morning. With the whole world order in a state of turmoil, it could be easy to overlook that other great threat to our peace and security, global warming. There had been a broad consensus, of course, that we need to cut carbon emissions and reach net zero, and pronto. But powerful players now seem to be backing away from what is a really basic plan. This week, under pressure from their own shareholders, BP abandoned plans to reinvent itself as a green energy company. Chief Executive Murray Auchincloss told the Financial Times that he sees a tremendous demand for oil and gas beyond 2050. And that followed announcements from BMW and other car makers that they'll keep investing in new hybrid and petrol models as they've watched sales of electric vehicles slow down. It now looks increasingly likely that Gatwick will get a second runway and Heathrow a third. So this new era of drill, baby, drill is upon us. Have the wheels of the net zero bandwagon come off then? And if they have, is there any way to get them back on? And while we're at it, by the way, what becomes of the North Sea and the great GB Energy project if the oil companies want to stick to, well, oil? Nigel Topping is a former UN climate change champion and a current member of the Climate Change Committee. They advise Westminster and the devolved governments on how to meet their green targets. Welcome to the Climate Show, Nigel. Thank you very much for being with us. What did you think when you heard what BP said last week? Did that take you by surprise?
Not really. I think they've been struggling to figure out how they navigate this transition. I think Auchincloss said that he thought the optimism in a fast transition was misplaced. I think his optimism that he's going to be able to double the value of BP is misplaced, because actually far from slowing down, we're seeing the transition, for example, to electric vehicles, which of course is the main driver of demand destruction for oil, continuing to accelerate around the world. Yes, you're right, it stutters in different places in different countries, but it's still going very fast around the world.
But that's your problem, isn't it? These companies are skittish, and their shareholders certainly are skittish. And when they see profits fall, they demand action, and they can demand a change of direction. If you're running a company and your investors say they're unhappy that your profits are falling and they could get more money if they were backing your rivals instead, you're going to do something about it. And that's where the rubber hits the road on an issue like, you know, net zero, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, it's not just about profits, it's about their expectation of future profits, and their expectation of the value they're going to get out of the company. And for many investors, the real value they get out of oil and gas companies is the dividends that they get. And in fact, for some time now, investors have been taking money out of the oil and gas companies to make sure that they're not over-investing in oil and gas, or over-investing in renewables, but not over-investing, because they want more capital discipline, so more money comes back. I think we're basically seeing investors say we don't really trust the oil and gas companies to manage the transition. And in fact, very, very small amount of the capital that's gone into the massive growth in renewables around the world has come from the oil and gas companies. It's coming from a new breed of major energy players who are focused on renewables.
Right, but nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that these big companies are now saying we're going to keep drilling and keep burning beyond 2050. What do you do about that?
Well, of course, they can't burn, only their customers can burn. So It depends on it, right? So, but
no point drilling if it's not ultimately going to be burned, is it?
Right, and this is a really important point, right? We know that the International Energy Agency, the sort of global expert on energy, says that we don't need new short-term supplies if we're going to stay on track to net zero. So the question really is, do you believe that we're going to stay on track to net zero? Well, in terms of oil, the biggest driver is the transition from gasoline-powered cars to electric vehicles. That's happening exponentially around the world. If you're in Shanghai or Beijing now, 50% of the cars are electric. In the UK, we're about over 20% by sales. But if you add electric vehicles and plug in hybrid electric vehicles, over 40% of cars by sales are being electrified. The Climate Change Committee, we see these costs of batteries coming down in a very predictable way. We think that in the next 3 years, every type of car, the battery electric car, is going to be cheaper to buy than the petrol car. They're already cheaper to run, which is why fleets are rapidly moving towards electric vehicles. But in the next few years, it'll basically be game over for the petrol engine. And by 2030, we think about 93% of sales will be clean battery electric cells, which of course means that we'll be able to rely on energy that we produce entirely at home to power those, as opposed to the fossil fuels where we're importing a large amount.
You seem quite bullish on this, Nigel. Are you saying that BP and BMW and all these big companies who clearly know their industries are getting it wrong?
Well, I think that separate BMW and BP. I think there's some real fantastical thinking from some of the oil companies who think that there's going to be massive demand beyond 2050. I mean, oil demand is largely going to be extinguished by 2050 because most of it goes into transport, right? So we're going to see oil peaking, and we are seeing gasoline sales peaking already in market after market. And of course, as electric vehicles, every electric vehicle that is sold is eliminating future demand for oil. The car companies are slightly different, right? Because they still exist in the future. You still need cars. You just need electric cars. The German car companies have suffered from two mistakes. They've been very late to the party. The Chinese car companies were seriously investing in electrification 10 years before them. And their cost base is very expensive, even relative to other car manufacturers. Your average Volkswagen has twice as many labor hours as your average Toyota, partly because of the way that the industrial governance of German car companies. But they've got a cost problem and a technology problem very similar to what happened in the States in the 70s when the first oil crisis hit. And of course, the States government and companies reacted wrongly, thought they could just keep selling big gas guzzling cars, as a result of which there's an awful lot of European and Asian cars on the roads in the States today. So when you lose that market share, you tend to lose it forever. So BMW have got some serious catching up to do.
All right, listen, we're going to leave it there, but thank you very much. That's really interesting. Nigel Topping there from the Climate Change Committee. Thanks for being with us on the Sunday show. Well, I wonder what Patrick Harvvey would make of all of this, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens. By good fortune, he sits beside me in the studio. Good morning to you.
How are you?
Thanks for being with us. I'm good, thanks. Good to see you. Nigel Topping sounding not too despondent there about all of this, kind of suggesting these companies are making their own decisions, but it's going to be all right because the big, broad winds are blowing in the right direction as far as he's concerned. Is that what you took from him? And if so, do you share that optimism?
Many of the economic winds are blowing in the right direction, but the problem is that many of the political winds are now blowing in the wrong direction. We see the rise of Trump and other far-right regimes around the world spreading climate denial conspiracy theories. We've seen a slowdown of some policy action here at home, both by the current and previous UK governments and I have to say by the Scottish government, where the energy strategy has been delayed, the heat and buildings bill has been delayed. That's supposed to help us get off the gas grid for our heating, and if we do that right, it's a really important way to cut people's energy bills too. So we really need to accelerate the action if we're going to be serious. But I think Nigel's point about the lack of trust that people should have, whether it's investors or anyone else in the oil companies, is absolutely right. And we've known for decades that these are companies that initially created and then boosted the climate denial movement, spent decades covering up what they knew and denying the truth, then spent another decade, maybe 1.5 decades, moving away from climate denial into climate delay, saying, yes, there must be a transition, but not yet. And now, even after having said for a little while that they're committed to the transition and they want to be part of it, they're slashing their investment. Their investment in renewables was always marginal. It's now pretty much, being abandoned.
But it's
so
all about
we
money,
cannot have any trust in those companies. We do need to make sure that there's a strong future for their workforce, who have a really important role to play.
Well, I mean, they're going to look after their workforce because they're going to keep these jobs open. Right? There's no need for a transition because they're not going to transition from oil to gas.
Not at all. Even under the status quo of fossil fuel production, oil and gas jobs have not been maintained at previous numbers. Oil and gas jobs are not safe for the long term from those companies' own plans. What we need if the workforce is going to have a genuinely long-lasting, successful future for individuals working there and for the communities that are dependent, is full square investment in the transition, the transition to renewables and to technologies like green hydrogen. And government needs to make that happen, for example, by taxing the wildly excessive profits of the fossil fuel companies.
Right, so big tax on companies like BP when they make announcements like this, punishment.
Not punishment. It's a question of making sure that the people who've caused the crisis pay for the transition. In much the same way as President Zelensky has been saying, yes, it's Russian frozen assets, and Keir Starmer's agreed. Russian frozen assets should pay for the defence of Ukraine. Yeah, the people who've caused the problem should be paying for the transition. And it's the oil and gas companies who've been raking it in for decades and slowing down the action that's necessary.
We keep being told by politicians like yourself that this just transition is fantastic. This is what's going to save jobs. It's going to move the industry to the right place.
If we get it right, it will do.
Well, yeah, but it had its first big test last month, didn't it, at Grangemouth? This safety net that the just transition is meant to offer, where if your job in fossil fuels goes, don't worry, you'll fall, but you'll be caught by this safety net that will give you a job in green renewables. They didn't. 400 workers were told their jobs were going, and they hit the dirt with redundancy notices. There was no safety net there for them.
Yeah, exactly. It demonstrates.
So it's failing.
It demonstrates that the kind of private owners that we see at Grangemouth don't, frankly, give two thoughts.
But it was the government that was meant to come in with this safety net.
Well, there has been no just transition in that instance because the power has been left with the private companies. And for decades, they have known that ultimately they will make changes that are going to put the future livelihoods of those communities at risk. Government needs to take power back from the kind of profiteers who've been making themselves billionaires, dodging their taxes in many instances, and simply not investing in the alternative future that those industries and those communities need. A just transition cannot be delivered by the private sector. They've demonstrated that they cannot be trusted to care about it.
Donald Trump, state visit or not?
No, I think it's very clear that we need to recognise the profound shift that is happening here. The new far-right US administration is profoundly hostile to basic democratic norms and to a great many global institutions that protect the peace, that invest in climate action and public health and so much more. Keir Starmer cannot continue to pretend that the world hasn't changed around him. There is a profound strategic choice to be made here. Are we going to stand reunited with our European family, the democratic countries in Europe, or are we going to kowtow to an increasingly brutal and authoritarian far-right regime?
He nodded at that when he was speaking to Laura Kuenssberg this morning. He said, we are intertwined, Britain and the US, like no two other countries are. Our security depends on this. We can't, you might want to walk away from them because you don't like what they say. We are absolutely linked to them for our own security and for our futures, no matter who's in the White House.
I can absolutely understand that description of the world as it has been in previous decades.
So unpick
but with the current US administration, that has ended. It's not being ended by me or by anything that the UK or other European countries
security with
do.
them?
It is being ended by the US. They are withdrawing from that.
Should we stop sharing security with them?
Right now, we're seeing them basically parrot Russian propaganda, the propaganda of an authoritarian
that's what I'm asking you. Should
that
we
has
stop
invaded
sharing
Ukraine
security
and then
with them
berate the victim. Donald Trump has stopped sharing that commitment to what used to be called the free world. What we're witnessing at the moment, whether you believe that something as simplistic as the free world ever existed, what we're witnessing at the moment is the USA withdrawing from it.
Right. Well, it is a bleak situation. Friday night was extraordinary. We will see what happens there. There is Patrick Harvvey, thank you very much indeed for being with us. There is going to be news made throughout the day, no doubt, at Downing Street and further beyond as these leaders meet today. Keep across the BBC for that. I'll be back in the telly next week. If you're with us on the radio, here's Andrew Black.